Thank you for joining me. My name is Alex. Welcome to the Beliefs Bazaar. In this video, I'd like to talk for a little bit about progressive politics. As a progressive, I would describe progressive politics as more of a methodology than an end goal. And in this case, most progressives would define our end goal as some version of social democracy. And generally, that just means that the working class are the primary beneficiary of their labor. The other thing that I'd like to point out about progressive politics is that we don't want to just pull the rug out of everything as it is and install a new system, And I recently made a video that discusses the top 5 issues that I feel that progressives have when dealing with MAGA, or rather the top 5 obstacles that progressives have to deal with when talking to MAGA or conservatives. You can check that out here. Also, I'd also like to say that progressive politics is not communism, and the goal is not communism or anything of that sort. In fact, it recognizes the position that we're at now and the goals we'd like to get to. So right now we live in a capitalist society, and most people are pretty accustomed to that, and myself included. I have a small business. Everyone more or less likes the system. We just think that it's a little unfair, and it's really tilted towards the wealthy and corporations and the people that run the corporations. And our labor is going towards things that do not really benefit us. And so the goal for progressive politics is to recognize and take stock of where we're at right now, and then make the best plan to get to where we want to go without causing, harm or serious disruption to anybody's lives or anything like that. Generally, when I sum up progressive politics in one sentence, it's usually that we would like to progress to a more equitable society. And I realize that is a pretty vague term, and so we'd have to define kind of what that is in many circumstances. And so as far as morality goes, I think our moral stance, or rather our moral values and priorities, should be some form of secular humanism, which prioritizes the human experience, and essentially we would like to create the most prosperity for the most people and reduce suffering for the most people as well. And so that would include a focus on individual liberties and providing equal rights and protections for women and other marginalized groups. And in addition, it would address wealth inequality. And while I realize, again, as I mentioned previously, we live in a capitalist society currently, and we don't want to end capitalism. We just want to make it more reasonable and more beneficial to the people that actually provide the labor for said capitalism. I suppose if I wanted to get pedantic about it, I would say that we would like to progress towards a more equitable capitalist social democracy. And so that has some factors. However, I would like to, in this video, address the top 10 issues as described by the voters in the last election, in the 2024 election. These are the top 10 issues that people reported in a Pew Research survey around the last election. In this particular chart, which you can look up yourself, it does describe, kind of the spread for, Harris supporters versus Trump supporters. I'm not really going to discuss that much in this video. However, I did think this was a useful chart because it does show kind of the spread on, which side of the political spectrum people prioritize these things. Instead of, just talking about kind of what the policies are right now or the suggestions that have been brought up by what people might consider progressive members of Congress, I'm going to talk about perhaps maybe what we would hope to do in these 10 areas. And you could perhaps say that this would be fantasy policy, because again, because we're taking stock of the current scenario and trying to get to a goal through incremental change, we don't always say what our final goal might be. And so, especially people on the right and even some liberal Democrats have made some pretty obscene suggestions that the goals are something communism or absurdities that are not actually realistic. While I don't actually think all of these are realistic, the goals that I have here, I do think that this might be a direction that we could go to get to where we want to go the fastest, or at least the most efficiently. Hopefully, people watching this, if you're on the right, you might, take what I have to say and understand that these are actually our goals for everybody, not just people on the left or not just people that are marginalized. This is a goals for across the board. As I mentioned before, equality for every demographic. And I know that progressives have a tendency to focus on identity, and that can be misinterpreted as prioritizing certain identities. However, if we just, you can recognize identity and still have equal civil rights across the board. As long as we have equal civil rights and equal protections across the board, no one should be left behind. And one more thing I'd like to mention before I get into these 10 topics is that education is not on this list. Now, I didn't look into it much beyond this list for this video. However, I imagine that education is a fairly important thing, although these 10 issues were the most important to voters in the last election. So my personal feelings are that education should be practically our top priority, because how can we make good decisions about our future or what we want for ourselves if we're not educated? We have to know and understand what's going on before we can make good decisions. So education should be a top priority. And real quickly, the current imbalance with education is because schools are funded by property tax revenue. So if there is a relatively poor or impoverished area, those schools in those areas are going to be very underfunded, and schools in more affluent areas are going to be very well funded, and those people are just going to have better opportunities and better chances at success. A better system would just be to whatever funding number that would be useful per student. And so however many students go to a school, that's how much money they get. So that would make it a lot better for education for all students. All right, moving into these 10 topics. The first one, of course, is the economy. Without making an extra long video that I could ramble on about, specifics within the economy, but I have thought of a couple points that might just be very substantial and would really help. Now, the first one that comes up is taxes. Income taxes is usually a primary point in this conversation. And I personally think that income tax should only be paid if you we could pick, I guess, an arbitrary number. If you make more than this amount, you pay income tax, and it starts at a relatively low percentage and increases, in the various tax brackets. And most people understand that, the tax brackets work. If you make the lowest income, you only pay this much tax for that bracket, and then the next set of values you pay, the percentage for that bracket. And so the way some people think this works, and the way I used to think it works until kind of recently when I looked into this, is that the more money you make, the more percentage you pay, kind of overall. But that is actually the case, is that you actually only pay that percentage for that income. So, if you make, I'll just say $1 million or more, you only get taxed that higher rate at $1,001 and above. So that $1,001, you get taxed more than you do on all the dollars below that $1 million mark. Even if you're making $5 million, you're not going to be taxed that total percentage on all of your money, just on the highest, between the 1 and 5 million, you'll get taxed higher on those numbers. I think that's a fairly good system. And, again, the better way, I think, to do it, we could pick a number where if you make more than this much, you get taxed so much. But those higher numbers are usually because people are making money because of other people's labor. So if you're a laborer, like the working class, and you just work your job and you get paid that money for working that job, I think everyone should keep that money. The taxes should be on corporations and individuals that their income is solely generated by other people's labor. So corporations should pay a higher tax rate because their profits are created by the labor force that works for them. So I don't think corporations should get to just keep as much money as they can get away with from our labor. That's not fair, and I think it needs to change. And I think anyone who has looked into this and considers it from that perspective would probably agree with me. Corporations shouldn't just get to keep however much money they can get away with of our labor. That's ridiculous. A potential solution that I thought of for this would be to pick, I guess, just pick kind of a baseline percentage for what that level of income should be taxed. And then we could add a percentage that is directly proportional to how many people live below the poverty line. Therefore, it has kind of a sundown effect where once our society, we take that extra money that's generated from this additional tax percentage and put that back into our society, such that if we raise everyone out of the poverty line, then corporations can pay less because we've already kind of raised the bar for everybody. The phrase that people like to say is that a rising tide lifts all ships. We create a better society for everyone with better outcomes, and then we wouldn't need to tax wealthy people as much anymore because we've gotten to a point where that is no longer necessary. So I really think that the corporate and higher wealth tax should be directly tied to the percentage of people below the poverty line. I think that's fairly reasonable. It would create a situation where, again, if the situations are better for everyone, then eventually wealthy people will pay less taxes. It'll just kind of work out that way. Another thing I would say for the economy is that we need to make investments in our society. And the thing that's been happening in the last, 40, 50 years is a lot of privatization, which essentially means that we've been taking what we consider government services or societal benefit programs, and we've been allowing private companies to handle those services. And so what that does is make a profit incentive. And so we're paying our tax money to a company that then provides the service and keeps some of that money. That seems absurd to me. I don't think we should just nationalize all these companies, but if it's a service that we pay for with our tax money, we shouldn't have to be paying someone to profit off of that. That should be a service directly to the citizens that pay the taxes. People get scared when you say things like nationalizing certain business or certain services and things. Like we should be doing that with healthcare, for example. The other thing I would suggest is for the military. There's no reason that we should be paying some company that can just set prices however they want, because currently there's not there's no regulations in place that say you can't charge more than this service or product is worth. They just get to pick the prices on everything and then sell it back to the taxpayers, and then take our money for research and development and keep the profits from those sales back to the government, back to us, to protect us and do whatever the military does around the world. That seems like a waste to me. I know recently the whole thing was waste, fraud, and abuse. We're trying to eliminate those things. Well, we should start with taking these privatized companies and just getting rid of the privatization aspect of it, and just allowing these services to directly benefit the people that pay for them, which are the taxpayers and the working class. Another policy that I feel like would be great for our economy is universal basic income. And, I know that there's a big conversation when people bring up universal basic income. The idea sounds good, but then people are like, well, it costs a lot more to live over here than it does over here. And what if people just take this money and use it for, alcohol or drugs or, whatever they think people do if they're given money or whatever. And I think that one way to address this is that if you live in an area, there can be, we can have basic income kind of situation where you're just given straight money. And then another part of that could be like a housing voucher type situation. So we could even break it down by zip code, where if you live in this certain zip code, there's a median income, there's a median housing price. And so if you live in a high rent area, your housing voucher would be worth more than in other areas that are lower cost of living. And that housing voucher isn't just a cash payment that is only given to a person who's actually using it for housing. So people can't just, stay living on the street and rake in all this housing income and not use it. you would still get your universal basic income, like cash payment, but then you could, get into housing because that housing voucher would be available to you, and it would be in the amount that's useful for your specific area. So I think the universal basic income conversation could use a few tweaks and get a little bit more specific about what we actually want that to be and how we would make it work for people in specific areas. All right, moving on to healthcare. And I briefly mentioned this. I think that if we just removed the private insurance industry and had a direct payment from our tax money to the healthcare services, that we would our money would go a lot further. We currently wouldn't need to increase the money spent on healthcare if we just removed that middleman and stopped allowing these companies to profit at obscene margins. And I know it's been in the news a lot recently with certain incidences that happened regarding either a healthcare CEO or just hearing about people that get refused service even though they pay insurance, and then they're getting denied on their claims when they have serious health conditions. I don't think that's fair. I don't mind, my tax money, even though I'm a fairly healthy person. I don't mind my tax money going to help people who are not as healthy, because that just helps all of us. We create a more healthy society, and we can invest in things more like preventative medicine and not wait for people to get sick before we give them health care, and sparingly at that. There's many people, insulin shouldn't cost any money, for example. Things like that. Again, and people talk about this one payer system. Well, again, a lot of these medical companies are, they kind of have either a monopoly on the scene or they work with each other to set prices. And so we're paying a high price to companies that keep profits and provide low quality services because they're keeping a lot of that money. And I know, sometimes people will say, well, what about all the people that work in these insurance companies and, our healthcare system and the tax dollars that go towards it? Well, if it were up to me, we would actually, as we're restructuring these things, we would have incentivized programs where if your job and career and all your education and training is to be in one of those fields that we're now deciding should no longer exist because we're taking away or we're eliminating the privatization of some of these industries, I think some of that money should go towards educating. And, so you would be, if you were working in one of these industries that is no longer going to be a thing, you could actually get paid to go to school and learn a new career. And then those job opportunities would be created by, programs that we have the money for now that help benefit society. So again, I think the way to solve that and not just leave thousands and millions of people out of jobs is to create programs that actually pay people to get re-educated in either, just school programs, degrees, or, technical training or other job training programs. Those should be paid programs for people that are changing careers from obsolete industries. All right, Supreme Court appointments. I was kind of surprised to see this as number 3 on the list, but it is very important to what is happening in the country. And ultimately, they are one of the checks on power. The way it's been going the last few decades, the Supreme Court currently is a supermajority for conservatives when the Supreme Court should be a neutral entity. If it were up to me to present my fantasy policy for the Supreme Court, I would clear the bench right now, introduce term limits, and then have I would hope an unbiased selection process, but I would just say currently a less biased confirmation process that would involve elections or confirmation through the House instead of the Senate, because the House is a more representative body of electors than the Senate. I know it's not on this list to restructure the government at all, per se, but I think we could probably get rid of the Senate, because anyone who understands how the Senate works will understand that the way the Senate works is fairly biased towards conservative red states right now, because I don't think it's really fair that California should have as many votes as the state I live in, Montana. Montana has a population smaller than a large city in one of the bigger states, so I don't think that we should get as many votes as California or Texas or Florida. That's just ridiculous. So I think confirmations for any political appointment or, Supreme Court or anything should be voted for and confirmed in the House rather than the Senate, just to get a more representative body of peoples voting on these things. All right. The next topic is foreign policy. And I'm not an expert or even that well educated on foreign policy, but I think if we approached foreign policy with a more humanitarian focus and prioritized assisting quality of life in other countries, we would have a lot less problems than we're currently facing, and other countries wouldn't be left behind while some countries like America and the other world leading powers kind of leave them in the dust economically and otherwise. I also think a good foreign policy with appropriate aid to countries that are having problems or don't have a strong enough economy to take care of their people the way we should be taking care of our own people, that eventually that would also affect immigration and some other things, which I'll get to in a moment, because generally what's good for other countries is good for us, and I'll discuss that a little bit more in the immigration section. The next topic is violent crime. And I know from watching the news or living in America that there's a lot of discussion that people are just criminals and there's bad people, and the only remedy for that is to lock people up. And I know that that is essentially propaganda from the industrial or the prison industrial complex. And statistically, it's shown that crime is usually a function of desperation and poverty. And I can speak to that for myself. I was a drug addict for a long time. I've been clean about 10 years. But back when I was using and broke and sometimes couldn't get a job, I committed more crimes. And it wasn't because I was a bad person necessarily at the time. I mean, at the time, you might have argued that. But it was because I was desperate and basically couldn't afford to eat because I had some other problems. So I would steal from stores to feed myself and engage with theft and other things to support my habit and stuff. So instead of going to jail, which I did a number of times, if there was a more robust system of rehabilitation and treatment centers and those kind of things that that were free to people that qualified or just, were having these problems, and then more robust social services to help people get back on their feet and reintegrate into society after that, we would have a lot less recidivism and a lot less people just going to prison in the first place. Furthermore, because of the economic policy I mentioned earlier, there would be funding for these social services and programs that help people reintegrate into society. Currently, we have, again, the problem with privatization. We have private companies owning prisons. And so they have a financial incentive to incarcerate more people and not rehabilitate them, because they get our tax money to keep people in, to fill those beds in those prisons. And again, that money isn't just paying for those people in those beds. It's going to paying for that plus profit for the people that own the prisons. And having been to jail a number of times, I can tell you that incarceration is the punishment. The loss of your freedom is what the punishment should be. There shouldn't be any other horrendous life, quality of life situations within those prisons. People always talk about how in some other countries, people have like PlayStations and TVs, and they have like a fish tank and, these large cells and stuff. They're not crammed like four to a housing block or many more in some cases, but cells have sometimes 2 to 4 people in individual cells, and that's just absurd. We don't need to do that. Again, incarceration is the punishment. Your loss of freedom is the punishment. We shouldn't be creating situations where people are essentially tortured the whole time that they're in there. That's absurd, and I think it's inhumane, and it's just not necessary. We should be focusing on rehabilitating people. If we decide that they committed a crime punishable by incarceration, then we should focus on educating them and rehabilitating them while they're in there, teaching them some skills and allowing them to have some opportunity once they get released to actually do something with themselves, instead of just, offering them nothing but the opportunity to commit more crimes, because that's all you really learn in prison is how to be a better criminal. Something I realized I forgot while I'm editing here is that, I don't know if everyone knows this, but one of the things that happens in private prisons is that people have jobs within these prisons, and they do a lot of different things. I'm sure you could find out what some of those things are if you look it up online. But in addition to us paying taxpayer dollars to these prisons to house, however many people, I believe there's a however many beds are full, they get a certain amount of money per bed. But then also these people do jobs at these places, and then, they're paid pennies on the dollar, for a commissary or whatever. And then the rest of that profit goes to the people that own these prisons. It doesn't go back towards the taxpayers. So the people that own these prisons are getting paid once by taxpayers and then again by the labor that they provide, and pay people pennies on the dollar. Now, if these prisons were owned by the government, perhaps, we could pay people maybe nickels on the dollar, and then the rest of that money could go towards actually funding the prisons so that we would actually save money, and it wouldn't cost us nearly as much to house people, and they would have better accommodations, and life wouldn't be so miserable. Because remember, the punishment is incarceration. It's a loss of freedom. It shouldn't then be torturous to live there. So maybe we could come up with some better systems. And, we talk about waste, fraud, and abuse, or rather that's what this administration sure talks about a lot. These are the places where waste, fraud, and abuse happens, is privatization, and they can arbitrarily just pick however much they charge for something and then not use nearly enough of that money to provide the service that they're supposedly supposed to be providing. All right, immigration. I know immigration has been a hot topic up until now, and it still is, especially with we've got ICE raids and, the government rounding up people and invading cities with military forces, with, the National Guard and otherwise, and just grabbing people off the street, putting them in holding places, and just deporting them without any due process in many cases. We don't really need to do that. If we look at the data, most people that are here illegally came here on legitimate visas and then just stayed after those expired. So they were let into the country legally, and because we either have a very slow process for naturalization of citizens, they end up staying longer than their visas and become an undocumented citizen. And the statistics say that immigrants are good for the country. They pay more, they pay taxes, and they don't receive as much benefit. So they're actually a net positive for the, income of the country. And I didn't want to take too long talking about statistics on these things, but I would encourage everyone to look up statistics that, regarding any of the topics I've been talking about, really. But, we have data that shows what's good and what could be good, or what we should be doing with these things. And right now, the data supports the fact that immigrants are good for the country. And if we're not just being prejudiced bigots about it, we can recognize that immigrants are good for the country. Furthermore, like I was saying earlier, if we had better economic realities and opportunities for citizens here in this country, and we were able to offer more aid to other countries and make their quality of life better in those countries, we would just have less people wanting to come to America for better opportunities. They would have those opportunities in their home countries. So helping us in the economy and helping other countries with their economy will naturally reduce immigration and create better quality of life for people here and abroad. Next on the list is gun policy. Again, this is an area where I'm fairly uneducated in, what might actually be the best thing for people, but I have a couple ideas that I think would be great. And this isn't necessarily something I came up with, but I agree with these ideas, and I think that it is worth our time. And that is to create a better screening process and background checks, more thorough background checks, and ending unregulated sales of guns. A lot of crime that happens with guns are guns that have been bought legally at trade shows or gun shows or whatever, and without documentation of ownership or whatever. And then those guns are sold illegally to people in, gangs or drug dealers or what have you. And that is the gun violence that we see on the streets. These guns originate from legal sources and are sold, directly to other people without documentation of sales. And so we could end that by restricting unregulated sales, increasing background checks. And as far as policy goes on what guns should and shouldn't be available to people, I would defer to people that are actually gun enthusiasts and responsible gun owners. There's plenty of them out there. There's lots of groups and gun clubs. Those are the people we should be asking about what is and isn't reasonable to be available to the public. Furthermore, we've heard the suggestion that there should be more licensing for weapons, such as, the example that people use is that you need to get a license to drive a car because that can be a potentially dangerous piece of equipment. Well, I think the same thing should be true for guns, and you should have a license to carry and operate whatever type of gun you would be interested in owning. And I personally think that this should be a service offered by the government. So if you would like to own a weapon, there's free training courses and and of course this would include background checks and those kind of things, but there should be free training courses and safety courses for people that would like to own these guns, and that should be paid for by the government, by tax dollars. Because even though someone like myself probably wouldn't take up that option, or maybe I would, I don't know, but while there be many people that won't do that don't care to own a gun and won't be taking classes to own one, it still benefits public safety. So I totally support and wouldn't mind paying for something like that for responsible gun ownership, because we should all, and I think especially people in the military would agree that just the random person off the street does not have the training or the safety wherewithal to operate an assault weapon, or again, this is my ignorance on guns showing here. But, military grade weapons should be owned and operated by people with military level training. You don't have to have gone to the military, but you should still go through the same training and safety courses that the people in the military go through so that they can operate those weapons safely. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. Next topic is abortion. Now, there's been a lot of, I think, propaganda to describe abortion as the kind of problem that it actually isn't. People don't just go get abortions willy-nilly, okay? That's not a thing that happens. I personally am never going to have, the need for an abortion, and I've been married for 10 years, so I'm in a committed relationship. And I don't actually think that people like myself should be making policy on this. I think we should be having doctors write this policy, and people that actually deal with health conditions with women and reproductive health. This should not be policy written by men who do not have medical training. That's just a silly thing to do. If it's something that involves the medical profession, we should be having doctors and medical professionals make policy for this thing, not just a bunch of dusty politicians that have an ideological bent. That's kind of all I have really to say about that topic. All right, next topic is racial and ethnic inequality. Now, I sort of addressed this in the intro to this video, where we should just be having equal rights across the board. And I understand that recognizing identity is tough for some people because they feel that they're losing somehow by elevating other people. And I realize that it feels like a loss to some people, but if your demographic, and I'm specifically talking about white men in this country, if we occupy the top 3 slots on the societal ladder, and now we're giving space to people to occupy the 2nd and 3rd slot, that will feel like a loss. And how we would take care of that is robust policy for across the board civil rights. Everybody gets the same civil rights. And I realize that there may be what feels like overcorrections in some area, but the good thing about progressive politics is we can then assess that situation and make further corrections if we need to. This isn't just a one-way direction. Progressive politics is about recognizing the current situation and then deciding what's the best way to get to the goals that we would like to achieve. All right, last topic on this list is climate change. Again, I am not a scientist or climate expert, and so therefore I should not write policy. And I don't think that anyone else who isn't a scientist or climate expert should be writing policy either. So again, we should be deferring to the people that are educated in these fields, the people that have the data, the people that take the data. They can make proper assessments as to what we should do regarding climate change. And I realize that that will also probably come with some heavy regulations and restrictions for corporations. But, that's just the growing pains of achieving goals that we would like to set forth and create a more prosperous future for ourselves. One in which we won't die from climate change or, create uninhabitable places around the world because we refuse to acknowledge this issue. And currently, the statistics show that larger industrialized countries, or the larger economic countries, are creating more of the pollution for the rest of the world, and other people are suffering because we have a more, I guess, robust system where we don't really feel those effects as much as places that don't have the resources to deal with it in the short term. We should be looking for long-term solutions so that our children and their children and so on will have a world to live in. We don't want to destroy this world for our future humanity. And lastly, I'd like to talk about what party we should probably support if we would like to instill progressive candidates and progressive policies. Now, while I don't agree with many of the things that the Democratic Party is currently doing, I think that the primary problem with both political parties, one more so than the other, but both parties have succumbed to financial influence right now. And so we have politicians that represent the top wealthiest and the top, big corporations and whatnot, and don't really seem to be advocates for the working class or just the general population of our country. While, again, I don't necessarily agree with most of the Democratic politicians that are in office right now or their policies that they put forth or vote on, I do still think that the Democratic Party is the best path forward for progressive politics, because they do still care about things like voter rights and respect the decisions of the people. So, if we have people that are more progressive candidates, I believe that they will get voted into positions, and then if there's enough of them, they won't be thwarted by the majority in the House or the Senate. And we would actually be able to put forth some of these policies and show people that they'll actually work for us. And so, again, the Democrats can be bullied into doing the right thing if enough people are in positions where they can present even these possible policies. So I guess in conclusion, one of my other topics that I like to talk about in most of my content, which I talk about beliefs and ideologies and kind of how they affect our interaction with each other, one of my main focuses is compatibility. And so while I don't expect everyone to agree with me or even agree with the people that are in office, if we get progressives in there, I hope that policies going forward will benefit more people and create a better outcome for the most people possible and reduce the amount of suffering for people that are marginalized and below the poverty line. And ultimately, I totally think that it's fine to have whatever belief you like, except when it creates an incompatibility with other people. And especially those of us in the working class, which I imagine I don't think anyone in the wealth class or corporate class is going to be watching this video. So anyone that's going to watch this video, we need solidarity, because if we can move forward as a united people, we outnumber the 1%, because we're the 99%. There's 99% of us and 1% of them. We outnumber them. So if we can come together and form a cohesive movement and just create better outcomes for ourselves and the future, I think that's the way to go. And so whatever your ideology is, whether you're a progressive or a conservative or a liberal or Democrat, or what have you, if you're MAGA even, I think the path forward is to recognize that we should not allow these different ideas to create barriers between us, and we should form together as a cohesive movement and try to make some kind of better future for all of us. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. I know I only addressed each of these topics just a little bit, but I didn't want to make this video very long, and I just wanted to put forth a few progressive ideas in case you are not a progressive yourself, and maybe you haven't heard some of the goals that we would like to put forth, because I know if you're not familiar, if you haven't heard people talk about what their actual goals are or what they hope for the country, then it's really easy to plug in whatever kind of idea and say that, oh yeah, they actually want this down the line. Like, they say they want this now, but it's going to lead to this, that, and the other thing. Well, I don't really appreciate those conversations because they can be very misleading, And, people tend to kind of grasp onto the first idea that they hear on a topic, and it's really hard to change their mind to a different version of that topic. So hopefully this will help discard some of the bad ideas that have been presented as, progressive goals when you're talking, when you're hearing it from someone who is not a progressive, because honestly, they don't really know what we think or what we want. And, I know there's been a lot of like boogeyman ideas that say that, like, despite what they say about something now, it really is going to end up as, communism or some other thing. This isn't a vacuum. We're not starting over as a society. I don't think that we should tear it all down and build it back up. That's not useful. That will cause a lot of unrest and suffering. Many people will lose their houses, their jobs, all these sort of things if we do something to disrupt the country or economy so thoroughly. So no matter what side of the spectrum you are on, or side of the political spectrum you're on, the idea of, just letting it get so bad that we rebuild up from the ground up, I just don't think that's a good idea. I think incremental change is the most reasonable thing to do, as long as those increments work towards a goal that works best for everybody. So thank you again for watching. I really appreciate it.